Welcome to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the Pulp Net, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Online at thepulp.net. In this Pulp Event podcast, Morgan Holmes discusses Robert E. Howard and Fiction House Publishers. The talk was recorded on Thursday, August 4th, 2022, at PulpFest 50 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
All right, Fiction House, 1921 to 1955, pretty successful pulp company, and very, very important for Robert E. Howard. To give you some stats here, look at my spreadsheet. Howard had 23 stories in action stories, and he had 13 stories in fight stories, but there was also 16 reprints later on. Weird Tales, there was 53 stories, 4 reprints, and 40 poems. There was some years like, he had 2 stories in 1931 in action, 5 stories in 1934, 6 in 1935, 6 in 1936. 1930, 7 stories, 3 in 1931, 2 in 1932 when things went under. I didn't know about the widow. Fiction House was darn lucky it didn't go the way of Clayton for that. But I'm going to talk about fight stories first. And, okay, let's just see if I can, or do I do it? There we go. All right, so, just some, the break there of when they went. Action stories made it the fall of 1950. Fight stories made it the spring of 1952. Robert E. Howard got into fight stories a year after it came out. And what's interesting is if you look at some of the people that were in fight stories, it was William Coughlin had edited it. And it was a mix of articles, columns, and true stories in addition to the fiction. I think people forget, boxing was hugely popular back then. My dad loved boxing. Probably that and baseball, I'm thinking, were two of the big ones. Hockey was probably just this weird thing by the Canadian border. And it's interesting, looking through the Fiction Mag's index, you had Arthur J. Burks, Jack Byrne, who was also co-editor, Theodore Roscoe, Rogers Terrell, Paul Gallico, the Poseidon Adventure guy, Eugene Cunningham, who was known for his westerns, Robert Leslie Bellin, were all in fight stories. And they also got this guy, Charles Francis Coe, who wrote a series about soccer dueling that was in Argosy and it moved to fight stories. But Howard's first story is The Pit of the Serpent, and there was an Arthur J. Burke story in the first issue. And the first paragraph is, the men of the Dauntless have disliked the Seagirl's crew ever since our skipper took their captain to a cleaning on the wharves of Zanzibar. Them being narrow-minded that way, they claim that the old man had a knuckle duster on his right, which is a ridiculous and dirty lie. He had it on his left. And so you can kind of see, there's a little bit of lightheartedness. Sailor Steve Costigan, he's on a cargo ship around the world. This way Howard could have stories all over the world. Pit of the Serpent takes place in Manila. And, what's interesting is there's like a screwball comedy aspect to it. It's almost like some slapstick going on there. But yet when he gets into the actual fight scenes, they kind of turn serious. Though he did in the Pit of the Serpent, I was landing the most blows that they rocked Sven from stem to stern, but they wasn't vital ones. Already his face was beef. One eye was closed, his lips were pulp, and his nose was bleeding. His left side was raw, but if anything, he seemed to be getting stronger. My training hadn't touched him a bit more than I realized. So something I have here, Howard had 7 stories in fight stories in 1930. He had 4 in Weird Tales. One could make a case. He was very much a Fiction House writer. In 1929, he wrote to Tevis Clyde Smith, and he said, my story, The Pit of the Serpent, came out in Fight Stories this month. Get a copy and read it. It will give you a good idea about how to write a sports story And style and form are not much, but the mechanics are perfect. Writing is a lot like architecture. The whole structure has to suit. Each piece has to be in place. A master of the game, like Kipling, for instance, or Jack London, always places the right pieces right. A dub like me stumbles onto the right combination once in every 500 stories he writes. But as I say, the architecture of the story is more nearly perfection than any other I ever wrote, regardless of the general merits of the story. In June 1930, Howard did have a serious story, The Iron Man. And it's probably about the closest you're going to get. That's the bulldog breed, the second story. And his bulldog, Mike, takes a big part in it. Howard loved his dogs, and Mike the bulldog is in many of the stories. And there's an interior there for that. Sailor's Grudge, another one. Very, very typical early 30s art. The Fist and Fang, another one. That takes place, again, in tropical areas. Howard could engage in any sort of exotic locale he wanted to. Here we go, The Iron Man. This is pretty much a hard-boiled story. It's about a guy that's a fighter. He's not a natural. He just kind of slugs it out. And Howard wrote about it in a letter. He said, got a letter from Fiction House. I'd written about Iron Men. He said they hadn't seen it, but he would try to trace it. I told him I'd rewrite it from the copy and send it to him if he hadn't gotten it. And he told him that he said to hold everything till he heard from me again. I hope he'll find it and take it. I don't see how a carefully addressed letter gets lost in the mail. He also said in response to remark that I was preparing more Steve Costigan stories. And for that. And I'm not blaming the editors as much as I used to. I write a good story and they enthuse about it. Next time I'll fall so much below standard, whatever that is, they get discouraged about me and forget about me. Oh well. And then in another letter to Tevis Clyde Smith, he mentions about they took another Costigan story for $100. They also finally located Iron Men and accepted it for $200. This is by far the best story I ever wrote. And in many ways, the best story of any kind I ever wrote. I guess my destiny is tied up with the Costigan family. I never sold fight stories, a story that didn't deal with them. The central figure of Iron Men isn't a Costigan, but both Steve and his brother Iron Mike figure in the story. The story isn't humorous like the others. It's harsh and brutal. I don't know whether the readers will like it or not. This would, for Iron Men, or the Iron Man, as it was rewritten, they also cut it down. It was heavily edited. Would fit, if you were to do like a hard-boiled fiction of the 1930s and have like W.R. Burnett, Hammett, Chandler, Iron Man would fit right in it. I mean, it's just very much of its time. Here's another Winner Take Coal. All the rest of the stories are Costigan stories for that. Winner Take All sold, they paid him $80. That would be $1,419 today. So if you're selling 7, 8 stories a year to a magazine, that adds up. Alley's Apparel sold for $80. And he mentioned to Smith, I'm not surprised that Byrne turned the story down. Like all my work, this is for Alley's Apparel, it was weak in plot construction. Few action stories have a plot worth a damn, but how the authors get by with them, I don't know. I can't. Perhaps the editors resented the touch of realism in the action. The fight was simply a dramatic description of the Goddard-Choinsky bout with a few changes, such as the ending. In the first fight, Goddard eventually won by his rough tactics. Flinging his body against Choinsky and crushing him through the ropes weakened the lighter man so much that Goddard knocked him out later in the bout. I read the Duel article in the Dallas News and am thinking of sending it to Lovecraft to show him what a hell ripper Uncle Terrence was. As if Lovecraft would have been interested in reading about a boxing match. A little bit of a disconnect there. But the Waterfront Fist, Alley's Apparel, Circus Fist, he's on the cover there. Again, on the cover. And for that. So he had a letter in 1931 and it was to Tevis Clyde Smith. I finally clicked with Action Stories, $75 worth. Street and Smith wrote me they want to take over the Steve Costigan series for their magazine, Sports Stories, which they say is bi-monthly. I told them I expected that Fight Stories would want to keep Steve, but offered them another prize ring series instead. I hope they'll accept. And in April 32, he wrote, so I sent it to Fiction House, and back it came with a statement that Fight Stories has been or is going to be taken off the stands. I mentioned to you a year or so ago that the magazine wasn't going to be published more than a year or so. So that kind of brings an end by early 1932 with Fight Stories. The Depression's going hard. Ed had mentioned about the widow wanted her money. They ceased fiction for a year, and eventually Fight Stories would start back up in 1936. And by when they did, it was already too late for Howard. So now we're going to circle back a little bit here to Action Stories. And I'll add one other thing about Fight Stories. I'm not sure, but it might be the first specialist sports story magazine. You had Street and Smith doing like Detective Fiction Weekly, Western Fiction Weekly, and as far as I can tell, I know like in the 40s you had baseball stories, football stories, all these specialty. And it's kind of a trend in the 20s to get these specialty magazines. And Fight Stories might be the first specialty sports magazine. Also seemed to be the go-to. Okay, it was also the go-to if you wanted to keep up with boxing. If you wanted to know about fights and things, you picked up Fight Stories. And so kind of an interesting hybrid aspect to being a pulp magazine, but kind of almost like a boxing-oriented Sports Illustrated. But, Action Stories started out in 1921, kind of a generalist action pulp. Some of the people in the early issues, Morgan Robertson, who was had been dead for like a decade. He specialized in sea stories. Murray Leinster, Gray Laspina, Wyndham Martin, Carl Detzer, Frederick C. Davis, Albert Richard Wetchen, L. Patrick Green, Anthony Rudd, Kenneth Perkins, A. Hyatt Verrill, Edwin Baird, Harold Ward, Carol John Daly, Dashiell Hammett had a story as Peter Collinson in one issue. And what's interesting, the earlier issues will say complete detective and adventure stories. So there's almost like an overlap with Black Mask at that early period, kind of had that mix of Western, detective, a little bit of adventure all in there before it kind of went into totally detective fiction. And there seemed to be a drift, going through the issues of the contents, but a drift as the Western kind of became predominant. By about 1930, you had a lot of like Eugene Cunningham, Walt Coburn, Tom Rohn, Harry F. Olmsted. And the covers were all for Westerns, in that period. And you did get a little bit of adventure with Arthur J. Burks and Theodore Roscoe going on, and for that. He did mention Howard in a letter to Tevis Clyde Smith. I got a laugh out of my story, which appeared this month in Action Stories, Sign of the Snake. They changed the name of the character, McClarney, to Steve Costigan, though the style of the tale was nothing at all like Steve. And they capped the story by the author of the TNT Punch. I never wrote a story by that title in my life. And I think they did that later on. Let's see here. TNT Punch is... That's actually January 1931. And so, they're changing names for that there. May 31, he mentioned he got paid $75 for the House Apparel. And it must be the regular price for short stories now. The stuff I quoted in my former letter about Costigan's belladonna spree was in the words of Byrne, verbatim, whatever the hell that means. I submitted a story based on the suggestion, and I hope he takes it. The yarn I sold, Action Stories, has characters named Mike Dorgan and Bill McGlory, and I just wonder if Dorgan isn't changed to Costigan before it appears in print. So it must be the Steve Costigan stories were pretty popular with Fiction House. The editors were changing it. And then 32, he wrote, Byrne rejects my tripe with reason. I'm slipping on Action Stories. Rather, I've already slipped. Mashburn complains that my characters are too bitter against the world and life as a whole. Continued disappointments in one's career are likely to curdle one's optimism. And then Action Stories took a break. He wrote to August or left in December of 33. Action Stories returned to the wars on a bi-monthly basis. I've landed only one yarn with them, but I hope to work out a series, as I'll be used to do in the past, with Steve Costigan, the fighting sailor. My character is one Breckenridge Elkins, a giant of the Humboldt Mountains whose exploits are the Pecos Bill style. And and at this point, when Action Stories came back, it was all Westerns. There really wasn't any adventure stories till 1937. You can see here with like the covers, this is earlier on, here we go, as it came back. Mountain Man, the very first Breckenridge Elkins story there, and A Gent from Bear Creek, 1934. And, once he was selling, he's just like an issue after issue from March of 34 up through January 37. And in fact, there are 18 Elkins stories, as many as there were Conan in Weird Tales. There were 17 Costigan stories for that. Let's just see here. So you can see, he's on the cover. Tom Rohn is the only other. Barry Scooby I've heard of. Eugene Cunningham who was just a huge Western writer at the time for that. The Haunted Mountain. Again, Howard's on the cover. Again, Eugene Cunningham gets the cover. Another one, War on Bear Creek. Here's an interior for War on Bear Creek. And that one came up. And that's an interior. That's a Rudolph Belarski interior there for one of the Elkins stories. Now, the Elkins stories are, pure humor. You had a little bit of seriousness with Steve Costigan stories, like in the fight scenes and some of the setups. This is, it's just pretty much, you can maybe call it cornball humor. Elkins is a big, like 6'6", lummox, raised in the mountains, just a babe in the woods. And like Mountain Man, the setup is Elkins gets his clothes stolen while taking a bath in the stream. And he decides to rob somebody to get some clothes. He needs a pair of pants because he's going into town. And his dad sent him in there. He's warning him about the thing. There's somebody called a sheriff, and they were, they tell you hand over your gun, you better do it. He said, well, how do I know these sheriffs? So they got this 10 star on them. But he holds up this guy, and he asks, what kind of people live in these hills anyway? And he said, most of them's Democrats, I said. But I got no time to talk politics. You climb out of them clothes. And it's kind of a lot of something that was found about some time back is, I've been speculating for years, did Robert E. Howard see King Kong? Well, in one of the Elkins stories, there's guys coming across a gorge, and he picks up the log and starts turning them, pretty much just like King Kong does in the movie. It kind of shows he probably saw King Kong for that. But just pure slapstick. How many of you knew that Robert E. Howard loved Marx Brothers movies? Yeah, you can kind of see it. It's like I was telling one writer about that. And on one hand, you got Groucho doing his monologues. You got to really pay attention to what he's saying. But on the other hand, you got the other two or three brothers, whichever, the slapsticks. You got this mix of different types of comedy going on there. And but with the Breckenridge Elkins, it's just pure, you could just, it's almost like Three Stooges type stuff going on where Elkins just gets himself into these situations and gets himself in deeper and deeper. It's very, very physical. And the other part is, it works for Howard. He had a knack for comedy. It's like, you always think of like, the Conan stories, the Weird Tales stuff, of this grim, dark, almost nihilistic, cosmic horror with gothic touches. And then you got this 180 difference in Action Stories with the Breckenridge Elkins. Now, obviously, they were popular. The fact that he had 18 stories, almost every issue from 34 through early 37. And it's so much that when Jack Byrne left to Argosy, he had him start up a new series for Argosy. And also, he was doing it for Cowboy Stories for F. Orland Tremaine, who he he was in Top Notch. Complete Stories, I believe, was a different editor. But it's interesting, Tremaine liked to use a lot of the same writers like Wandrei, Murray Leinster. He would get them in all those magazines. And would have been interesting to have a Donald Wandrei Western. And he wrote the Lovecraft in 1934. Action Stories is running a series of humorous westerns concerning the mythical exploits of one Breckenridge Elkins. Price read some of these stories and seemed to like them very much. E. Hoffman Price. He advised me to try and smooth the smooth paper market with this character, and I think I will if I ever get around to it. At present, I'm trying to crash a new Western market. And then he mentions the Lovecraft in May of '36. The new editor of Argosy has asked me, namely Jack Byrne, asked me to create a new Western character on the order of Breckenridge Elkins. And I've made one in a person of Pike Bearfield of Wolf Mountain, Texas. I don't know how it'll come out. If I can get a series running in Argosy, keep the Elkins series running in Action Stories now a monthly, and the Buckner James Grimes stories and cowboy stories, I'll feel justified in devoting practically all my time to writing of weird stories. And this was a time where Weird Tales owed him a lot of money. You know, he'd written letters to Farnsworth Wright saying, hey, can you speed it up with sending me monthly checks. You know, his mom was sick, dying, they had bills, and he pretty much walked away from Weird Tales. He had even asked E. Hoffman Price about Weird Tales. He asked, is Weird Tales a racket anymore? And, you know, he had had serious doubts about Weird Tales. He had walked away from it. Let's go here. Again, he's on the cover. And then here's an ad from 1936 for Fight Stories. He's coming back. Love romances going on there. And then in the late 30s, early 40s, Fight Stories reprinted the Costigan stories as under the pseudonym Mark Adam, and then they renamed the stories. And so here's one right here. You can kind of see the late 30s art. You know that it's different from the early 30s going on there. And John Starr, one of the Fiction House names, they changed Cannibal Fist from Fist and Fang. Here's another nice cover there. The Rube of the Racketeer. I mean, talk about a classic 30s hard-boiled. You know, looks like this guy, he's probably being told to take a dive. And there's the gangster with the gun pointing it at him. It's like, take a dive or else. And, there might be some great hard-boiled fiction to be mined in here for that. Here's one from during World War II from 1942. A lot of these authors in this period, Bill Human, I do recognize. He wrote gold medal paperbacks later on, westerns. And about 15 years ago, my old buddy Steve Tompkins was reading George Orwell and came across something about Fight Stories. And there was a description. He tracked it down. Orwell read Howard. It was probably from 1938. It was the story, including the Scandinavian from fall 1940, which was originally Viking of the Glots. But Orwell happened to have this to say about Howard. A paper like Fight Stories, for instance, would have very little appeal except to sadist and masochist. So it's kind of an interesting thing. George Orwell had actually read Robert E. Howard boxing fiction on that. So that's a bizarre thing. Speculations. We got to get into it. Howard died at age 30. If he hadn't picked up the Colt 1903 .380 caliber and put a bullet through his head, had he lived. He had said to Derleth, I had no confidence in my ability to write convincingly on science fiction. Frankly, it seems to be the average pseudo-scientific tale, always accepting the really fine stuff of such men as Wandrei, Williamson, Keller, and a few others, is pretty poor stuff, below the average level of the weird detective or adventure yarn. The reader of this type of fiction seems to demand the same plots over and over again, to resent the slightest variation. And Darrell, I remember, once said, a lot of the science fiction in the 30s was sub-pulp. It wasn't even good enough. Your stuff in Wonder Stories and Amazing was sub-pulp. And, Howard didn't seem to have much interest in science fiction. But First Jungle Stories came out in 38, Planet Stories in 39. I could have seen Howard writing backup stories for Jungle Stories. I am probably the only person in the world who's a fan of Armand Burgot, or Burgot, however you pronounce him. He wrote a lot of backups for Jungle Stories. Supposedly he'd been in the French army in North Africa. He was part American, part French, and was invalided out for wounds across Africa. And you read his stories, they're very, very authentic sounding. A lot of them set around Chad. And he wrote a lot of really cool lost race stories. I could see Howard doing something like that for Jungle Stories. Who knows? Maybe he even could have written a Keygore story or two. Planet Stories. It's a different sort of pulp. My favorite science fiction pulp. I have all 71 issues. And there were some authors different. You had like Wilbur Peacock, Emmett McDowell, who really weren't in other science fiction pulps. The interesting thing is, you get into Planet Stories about the into late 40s, you start seeing a Robert E. Howard influence of some of the writers. You see it with Lee Brackett. She has these barbarians on Venus and elements of it in her Martian stories. Gardner Fox, you read his stuff, you can see the Howard influence. And the big one, Poul Anderson, which I reprinted here, The Virgin of Alcarion. Anderson had 3 very Howard-esque stories in Planet in around 1950. And if you were to file off the serial numbers and present them to somebody, you could probably almost pass them off as Howard stories. So, I mean, there's always that chance if Howard would have kept going on. Planet Stories could have been a market where he could have written barbarians on other worlds. In fact, this issue says a barbarian worlds novel. And so it's an interesting thing. Planet just has this certain type of story set on other planets where they're kind of sword and sorcery, but they kind of cover it over with pseudoscience. And Anderson was going for full Howard mode with these 3 stories for that. But we're kind of at an era now where does anybody write boxing fiction anymore? Does anybody write sports fiction anymore? And but the boxing was hugely popular, and the Costigan stories were so popular. They were reprinted in Fight Stories with 16 reprints in the late 30s and into the 40s. So it goes to show, they viewed the Costigan stories as great boxing. And they're a lot of fun. They're just to read the fight scenes, they're brutal. And for that, but the Elkin stories are, you space them out. I mean, it's kind of like Jethro Bodine and Ellie Mae. You want to, it's very much, it's Ailmon Pa Kettle, and, very, very much, burlesque, and, you space those out. And I was looking to see if Dave Gensel might be here tonight, because he edited, hey, there's Dave. Dave knows way more about the Elkin stories than me. And because he edited the book for Bison Books, the humorous westerns, and for that. So, you have any questions about Elkins? Ask Dave. Yeah, Dave.
You mentioned one specific case you cited in one of the letters. Do you know if Howard's had many of these stories rejected from either action or fight stories, or were they pretty much publishing what he sent them?
Most of it. I think there's like 2 stories that got rejected, and he even pretty much admits. He said I was slacking. And I think one of them he rewrote, and they then accepted it. So if there's any rejected stories, there might be one, and I might be wrong on that. So he seemed to have a pretty great relationship, far better than with Farnsworth Wright. Jack Byrne and William Kofoid. Oh, an interesting thing is Kofoid then was with Jack Dempsey's Fight magazine. Howard sent stories there. That magazine folded. Kofoid then went and got the story. He went over to Dime Sports. There was apparently a whole bunch of fiction mags people over with Popular, and he got 2 stories. One story for that. But at that point, Howard had mentioned to Klein. Otis Klein got pretty ticked off about it, and Howard said, "Hey, just this one time, I'm still using you as my agent." But Howard said, I just want to use this as a means to get my foot in the door with Popular publications, which I've been wanting to do badly. He said, I'm burned out on sports stories and I want to move on. And so it's an interesting thing. But, Kofo had thought enough of Howard to take those stories that were still in stock when Jack Dempsey's went under and got him in, went around to the other and got him in with Popular. Yeah, Daryl.
Your comment about Howard and the Marx Brothers and Dreams make, did Howard ever know the Three Stooges?
I think they started right after he died. I've looked at that.
33.
What?
They started about 33.
Oh, I thought it was 36. There's no mention of them, the Marx Brothers, and it seemed like when the movies, he saw everything. But he seemed to like comedies, like these 30 screwball comedies. But, no mention of Three Stooges. I'm sure he would have loved Curly. Curly was the funniest man on the planet ever. John?
Do you think Howard knew that Fiction House had writers under contract? Like Coburn and Ted Roscoe?
He never mentioned it that I could find in the letters. Most of the letters mentioning Fiction House are to Tevis Clyde Smith, and it's basically about sales. It's like, hey, I just sold this story. I made this much money. He mentions the Lovecraft in 2 letters. But, I don't think he had any idea about any contract with, Cunningham and Coburn and those guys. Maybe that was a tight editorial secret. Yeah.
What you didn't mention about Costigan and James Dorgan is the use of the unreliable narrator. And Howard used that with tremendous humorous effect.
Yeah.
And you're reading what the narrator says, which is the same with Costigan or the...
Yeah. Oh, it's just like, the one about the knuckle duster, about the other crew lying. It's just like, he had it on his left, they're lying.
But while you're reading what he knows, you're realizing what is actually happening.
Yeah, the first person, now he was going to rewrite an old Costigan story that was unsold, and he was going to put it in third person. It might have been for Dime Sports in the letter. He said, I may they want everything in third person. So that would be more difficult to do. Like you said, the first person does work for comedic effect. But the Costigan stories, though, like I said, there's comedic aspects. But boy, when you get into the fight scenes, they kind of turn serious in a way, in a humorous way.
When was the American movie?
39.
But I can sure see the American planet.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Future Adventures of Esau Cairn. It would fit right in. It was, it's very much like a Barosian Sword and Planet, and he could have, Elmer has a lot of episodes, especially like the first 40%, and he could have broke those up into separate stories, kind of worked them around and the like, and it's, the Howard effect is there in Planet, with Brackett, Anderson, Gardner Fox, Alfred Koppel, Warlord of Valkyr. Great story. You got, starships moving, knights in armor on horses around the different planets. It's a fallen galactic civilization. Hey, we're right on time.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines for over 25 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Also, look for the PulpNet on Facebook and on Twitter. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. This Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2022 by William P. Lampkin, all rights reserved.